Welcome back everyone, Abyss Full of Goats here, and today we're going to continue our series looking at the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Through booster packs. Today we're going to cover the second ever booster released in Metal Raiders, and I couldn't be more excited for this because this one is my nostalgia set. Now while I only bought 3 or 4 LOB packs when I was around 7, I must have bought a few boxes full of this set because it was cheaply available in the Spanish resort I went to every year on holiday. Don't worry, I will look at this set as unbiased as possible. Now, Metal Raiders was the second of 2 boosters released in 2002, and right off the bat we can see that the designers at Konami learned a lot from LOB. While we do still have a lot of bad vanillas and terrible effect monsters, it definitely seems like Konami wanted to make monsters more than mere beatsticks, giving us game-changing effects like Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. However, even more so than this, we got a massive power increase for spells and traps this time around, with several cards that not only changed how the game was played in a lot of ways, but many are still being played today, or at least would be if they weren't still banned for like 20 years. Yeah, I'm very excited to look at this, so let's get into the set, shall we? You know, in retrospect, I think I might have been a bit too hard on the secret rares for LOB. It's true that Trihorn Dragon was just a weak at Blue Eyes, and Gaia was a bad fusion monster, but at least Trihorn was a decent float target, and at least Gaia could theoretically be a Metamorphosis target. So far, I have found no use whatsoever for Gate Guardian. The first level 11 monster in the game's history, Guardian had an impressive 3750 attack points, which was the highest stats for a monster at this time. Pity the summon requirements were nowhere near worth it, as Guardian required the sacrifice of Suijin, Kazajin and Song of the Thunder, 3 level 7s to summon him. So basically, to summon this card normally you'd need 2 tributes for each of the pieces and then 3 tributes for the Guardian himself, meaning this effectless beater requires in reality 9 tributes to summon him, before he immediately gets killed by a trap hole or dark hole, because you know your opponent's going to have removal by the point you summon this thing. Now yes, as the years went on, there were easy ways to summon this card. Like for example, after Duels to Lions, you could pendulum summon the pieces. However, by that point, why would you make this guy over a rank 7 like Big Eye or Draco Sack? And that's assuming you didn't just keep the pieces on the board, because spoiler alert for future entries on this list, all the Guardian pieces are better than Guardian himself, with good stats backed by actual good effects. This card is so bad in fact that when Konami made the Gate Guardian archetype, they didn't even include the actual Guardian in any way, choosing instead to simply remake it as an actually pretty good fusion monster. Now keep in mind that the pieces are played in the new deck, so it's not an age problem, it's a quality one. So with it being bad on release, bad as time went on, and even bad in its own archetype, Guardian in my view is the worst secret rare we've covered so far in this series. Outside of the broken back row and power crept monsters, one theme of Metal Raiders was reprinting starter deck cards. Sadly, with one exception, most of these cards reprinted were less based upon playability but rather than popularity from the anime, as most of them were cards Yugi played, like this one, Feral Imp. Nothing much to say about Feral Imp as a card itself. It's a low stats dark vanilla fiend, meaning it's mostly unplayable, however it did have a lot of equipment it could use. Doesn't make it playable, but at least puts it above most of the set's bad vanillas. Speaking of which, another starter deck Yugi card, Winged Dragon Guardian of the Fortress, despite its slightly higher stats, is actually in my opinion even worse than Feral Imp, because unlike Imp it only had one equip option at the time that was okay at best, meaning that often it would lose out to weaker dark and light monsters. Again, neither are worth playing, but Imp is slightly better in my opinion. The only thing interesting about this card is it was Yugi's first hologram, which is something I guess. And now we have a reprint from starter decks that was actually warranted in Summon's Skull. Now Skull was the best trait monster in the game at the time, often being the top end of the vanilla beatdown deck that dominated Yu-Gi cover format, so it's nice to see him get a foil version. Nothing much to say about Skull himself unfortunately. He was an amazing beater, arguably the first competitive boss in brackets monster, and the best removal bait in early Yu-Gi-Oh! Unfortunately, you didn't see much competitive play beyond this point, as decks like Hand Control and Critter would push beatdown decks to tier 2, and those beatdown decks would often replace Skull with another 1800 beater to complement Le Jin. However, he will always have a place in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, and will always be a terror to those who play Yu-Gi Kappa format. Shine on, you ugly bugger, shine on. Another bad vanilla, the only thing notable about Rock Ogre Grota number 1 is the funny scene in the anime where he's blown to dust by of all cards Happy Lover. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say about it. Next. Well, he's the biggest normal summonable vanilla we covered, which is all I can say about Armored Lizard. He's not a good card, but he can beat up Feral and Winged Dragon, which I guess makes him better than those cards. Next. It's a B. That's all I can say. We have dragons, skull demons, and 3-layered monstrosities, and then just a B. Doesn't say about this one, it's just a weaker winged dragon guardian on the fortress. Same attributes, same defense, lower attack points. Next. And now we're in for a treat. Not just a bad card, but quite possibly the worst Yu-Gi-Oh card ever printed. Thanks to the likes of Yugioh, this infamous card has become one of the biggest memes in the Yu-Gi-Oh fandom. It's a Larvae Moth. A 500 attack monster, this card would be bad enough if it was normal summonable. However, no, you need to pay a cost to summon this piece of fish bait. You see, for the privilege of summoning this monster, you use to summon Petite Moth, an even weaker monster, equip it with a Cocoon of Evolution, which admittedly will give it a decent defense stat, and then wait 2 turns to summon a monster Petite Angel could squash. I don't think I had to harp on how bad this card is, however I do surprisingly have one positive thing to say about this card, and all the other Cocoon lineup. That being that at least these cards have excellent flavour, with a Cocoon turning a caterpillar into a moth, with it growing bigger and stronger the longer it's in the cocoon, and the caterpillar still being weak if the cocoon is popped too early, making quite a lot of sense. Doesn't make any of these cards any better, but as I can say, some thought was put into the design. Next. Next we have another vanilla that for its time was pretty useless in Harpy Lady. However, due to both new support for the card and it actually making Yu-Gi-Oh history, I would absolutely rank this card above the majority of normals from not just this set, but even LOB as well. Firstly, there is an argument to be made that Harpy Lady was the first archetype in Yu-Gi-Oh history, as this card was the first one in the game to have cards that worked with it that mentioned the card they supported by name rather than type. Now personally, I would argue that the honour of the game's first archetype goes to Gravekeepers, as they were the first series of cards whose entire deck focused on playing cards with the same first name that support each other. However, Harpies definitely set the groundwork for decks like Gravekeepers and future archetypes. However, more importantly, unlike Gate Guardian, Harpy Lady is still used in the modern version of her archetype, as many of the cards the deck runs require some form of Harpy Lady, and some builds prefer to run her over the upgraded Cyber Harpy because she's an unexpected die target. Overall, much like Skull Servant last time, Harpy Lady isn't very good by herself and was awful upon the set's release, but gained value over the years by Konami giving her a family and a bunch of new accessories. Following on from Harpy Lady, we have 3 of them, with Harpy Lady Sisters, a 1950 beta whose only effect is she requires an elegant egotist to summon her. Now, like Harpy Lady, I will give credit where it's due, as if this was the first monster that can be summoned from the deck into play. However, that's where the compliments end with this card, as like a Gate Guardian, she is nowhere near worth running essentially 2 bricks in your deck to play. Now, like Harpy Lady, Sisters does have some cards that require her to use them in the new archetype. However, even Konami realised that making this card, to quote Ranked in Yu-Gi-Oh, a mule for your cards, wasn't very good and made several ways of circumventing Sisters, so she's even good there. Overall, yes, Sisters is unique for the time and was an OK beta, but like several of the experimental cards in this set, she has way too high a cost for too low a payout and just not worth playing. Another 1500 attack body that was reprinted from the starter decks. Now, like Feral Imp, this card's on the higher end of the vanillas because he has more equipment that works with this type and attribute, but he's still just another bad vanilla, nothing else to say. Next. The next part of the amazing Lava Moth combo, everything I said about Lava Moth in terms of flavour also applies to this card. However, I do have everything I said about Cocoon of Evolution that don't apply to the other cards in its combo. Firstly, this is the only card in the group that has some use on its own, as there's another 2000 defense wall, which technically puts it on par with the likes of Giant Soldier of Stone and Aquamador as a wall card. Now granted, in a defense focused deck you likely wouldn't play this card over the other options due to the lack of attack points, but it does make this card technically playable, which is more to be said for the rest of this group. Secondly, like Harpy Lady, this card made Yu-Gi-Oh history, as technically you could argue this card was the prelude to Union monsters. Yes, I'm aware it isn't a union by itself because it can't unequip and summon to the field, but this was the first card that introduced the concept of monsters equipping themselves to other monsters, so you can indirectly thank this card for the likes of XYZ and ABC. Okay, so now we have another recycled art card in Crawling Dragon, which is just Dragon Zombie left out in the sun too long. In fact, this card even shares an attack set with the zombie, and was used to summon the Dragon Zombie in the anime, so at least we can see that they weren't trying to hide the connection. Other than the palette swap, I have nothing more to say about this card. It's a tribute monster with no effect that dies Jin, making it unplayable. Next! Speaking of Dragon Zombie, here we have the Warrior Zombie to go along with it in Armoured Zombie. Unlike the Dragon, however, Armoured Zombie never saw any play because while it is a dark, it falls below the 600 point minimum of 4-star or below monster needed to see play at this time. Nothing more to say other than like most zombies around this time, it does have cool card art. Okay, seriously, how has this card not seen more play in GOAT format? For those who don't know, Mask of Darkness is a flip monster who allows us to recycle a trap card from the graveyard when flipped, meaning this card gives us an additional copy of Mirror Force, Trap to Shoot, Ring of Destruction, etc. In addition to this, it's also a dark monster for chaos plays, and a flip monster meaning it can be set with Night Assailant. This is honestly in my view one of the best monsters to come out of Metal Raiders and is very underrated in my eyes. Its spell cover Magician of Faith sees a ton of play in GOAT, and I think this card deserves much more play than it gets. Another in the long line of bad tribute monsters from this set, Domo the Angel of Silence shares stats with the Crawling Dragon, and is bad for the exact same reason the dragon is. Also, like all of the dark monsters from this time, it's slightly better because of the dark equips, but that's not saying much. This is also the last card Pegasus saw in the original version of Yugioh, as he was killed by Bakura shortly afterwards, so that's an interesting fact. Also, I guess you could argue this card was somewhat decent for memories if you could pull one, but that really isn't saying that much because you have to get that quite late in the game. Anyway, next. Fans of the Progression series will no doubt remember this card and the havoc he caused in early episodes, and he did pretty much the exact same thing in the TCG. You see, when White Magical Hat deals damage to a player, that player must randomly discard one card from their hand. Now with how powerful cards like Trap Dust Shoot are, it's not hard to see why this card was good, as repeatedly removing an opponent's resources can oftentimes mean game over, especially in a simplified game state late game. However, what made this card even crazier was that decks that ran him during Critter format technically had 7 copies of the card in deck, due to having 3 copies of the card himself along with 2 Sangans and 2 Witch of the Black Forests to search him, meaning that whenever an opponent was free to direct attack, you could just get a Recruiter destroyed, then summon this guy and rip a card from their hand, giving you a leg up in the grind game that was early Yu-Gi-Oh! Now this card's sole claim to fame is that he has probably made many players have to resubmit deck lists for major events, as his name means you couldn't use the shorthand name for an actually good card. Other than that, this guy is just an ancient telescope on a body, a card that wasn't even good in the first place. I mean, I guess this card could help you draw better by stacking your deck, but to do that requires you to play this card as a brick in the first place, so that's kind of fixing a problem he causes. Why isn't this card level 8? Once again we come to the cover card of a set in Black Skull Dragon, a fusion of Red Eyes and Summon Skull that has a massive 1300 attack points, which would have made a great Metamorphosis target were he level 8, not 9. Once again, just like Gaia, this card's level makes it mostly unplayable, except it's even worse here because at least with Gaia, there was a couple of level 7 targets for Metamorphosis you could see play, not so much level 9s. So again, because of its level and fusion summoning being awful at the time, Black Skull Dragon saw no play, which is a pity for a card with such great artwork. Here's hoping for Rise we see a retrain of this card sometime soon. And next we come to another one of the best monsters from this set, in Masked Sorcerer. Essentially the opposite of Magical Hat, Sorcerer allows its user to draw a card whenever it inflicts battle damage. Now everything I said about why Hat is good also applies here, as this card was another way during Critter format to win the game should it go long by out-resourcing the opponent, and it was also searchable by Witch and Sangan. However, I'd actually argue that Sorcerer is even better than Hat, as unlike Hat its effect is never dead, because their opponent won't always have cards worth discarding, but there will never be a point where drawing a card is bad in Yu-Gi-Oh! Another vanilla fusion, this card isn't traditionally played in GOAT format extra decks as a Metamorphosis target, because historically there haven't been that many good level 6s to target with stat deal beyond Chaos Sorcerer and the Monarchs. However, with recent developments that may change, as with the discovery of the powerful Cold Wave Monarchs deck, yes, I'll be doing a video on that sometime soon, don't worry, we now have a deck that this card can be used against, so we may start to see older control decks like GOAT and Chaos run this card in their extra decks. However, this card is actually more famous for being used in combination with another card that circumvents fusion summoning, Magical Scientist. A sort of Metamorphosis on legs, Scientist lets you pay 1000 life points to summon a monster with 6 stars or less from the fusion deck, and this wasn't a once per turn effect. This, along with Catapult Turtle, created one of the first viable FTK strategies. A Scientist would summon all the high level fusion monsters and then fling them at the opponent for an OTK. Because of the 1000 point cost per monster, this combo required monsters with 2000 or more attack points to be flung in order to kill their opponent's 4 life points when out, so cards like Snake and a few of the cards from the set were often played at 3. Wow, a bad card from LOB is all grown up, and it's still just as bad. Yeah, I know I made a similar joke in the LOB video, but I have little to say about this card as a monster and a card. It's a weak walled monster with similar stats to Celtic Guardian. Also, the most interesting thing about this card is the censorship went through in the TCG, because in the OCG this card is literally fully nude. No, I'm not joking, I know I can't show it you here on YouTube for obvious reasons. Honestly, I'm generally surprised even in Japan that was allowed. Next. Well, at least this card got a pretty big upgrade later on. If you want to talk about that, you can go watch my Switch Deck Scrutiny on the Water deck. Again, like most vanillas in this set, I have little to say here other than I like the artwork, and apparently Konami did too, as they remade this card into a brand new monster that was okay at least in a future set. Next. Honestly, just repeat what I said about Lava Moth in terms of playability and flavour, and you pretty much have my thoughts on Petite Moth as well. The thing to say here is that this card is slightly better, as it can be normal summoned, but that's like saying a punch to the stomach is better than a punch to the eye. It doesn't actually mean anything. Next. Now, unlike the card it was initially designed to summon, Elegant Egotist was actually an okay card at the time that became broken once the deck became an actual archetype. You see, while designed to summon sisters from the deck, Egotist could also be used to summon Harpy Lady herself, which at worst makes her 3 extra copies of Unexpected Die. However, with so many of the cards in the archetype sharing the Harpy name, this card is basically an e-telly for the deck, but being one of the best starters and extenders an archetype could hope for. For our next entry, we'll be looking at not 1, but 3 cards, with the 3 pieces that make up the Gate Guardian, Suijin, Kazijin and Song of the Thunder. The reason being they're all basically the same monster with slightly different stats and different attributes. All level 7s, these 3 cards are all massive beaters that share the same effect, which is that once we're on the field, they can make an opponent's monsters attack 0 during the damage calculation when they're attacked, meaning that each of these monsters are guaranteed to win one battle with a bigger monster, making them very hard to remove in battle. Which of course makes Gate Guardian look even worse, because if you did play these cards, why would you want to give all that up for a bad vanilla? In addition to this, unlike the Gate Guardian himself, these cards do actually have a modern playability, as they are a central part of the modern Gate Guardian deck, which requires them to make its powerful fusion monsters, including a double spell and trap negate and a pseudo towers monster. Now, overall, until their new support, these cards still didn't see too much play because they were 2 cost tribute monsters. However, they were still a step up in quality from cards like Gaia and Dark Magician, so they definitely marked a step in the right direction for 2 tribute monsters as time went on in the game. Once again, we're going to group a few cards together for this entry, with all the weaker cards from the set that can attack directly through opponents' monsters. Let me ask you guys a question. If there was a burn spell released around this time that said inflict 500 damage to your opponent, but you can't normal summon this turn, would that card have seen any play? No? Well, that's pretty much the best you can hope for here, as all of these monsters are so weak that even if you summon them and got a direct attack off, they would almost certainly die on the crackback, meaning you essentially, like I said, got a burn spell that cost a normal summon and did you damage next turn. Honestly, the only one of these cards worth talking about is Jinzo 7, because 1, he somehow came out before the actual Jinzo, and 2, he was a good fusion material in Forbidden Memories. Otherwise, none of these cards are worth playing over a burn spell. So we've got an insect-looking monster, yeah I know it's a machine but it looks like a bug, whose effect destroys a monster. So another Mighty Bug, right? Nope. Honestly, reading this card, I gotta wonder, did the designers think Mighty Bug was broken or something? Because this is one of the worst overbalanced retrains I've ever seen. Firstly, it can only trigger its effect when it's attacked, making it a lot less versatile than the bug, which would be bad enough by itself, but it gets much worse. Because you've got to wait a whole 2 turns for this card to destroy the monster that attacked into it. So basically, you need to get this card on the field, hope a monster worth destroying swings into it, and then pray that that monster lasts for 2 turns. Which likely means you're already losing the game because it implies that you can't remove that monster by other methods in 2 turns. Honestly, I don't know what they were thinking with this card. Not only was Mighty Bug a better card than this by a country mile, it was actually easier to get than this card because it was available in starter decks. So it didn't even make sense from a budget standpoint. Just all around one of the worst effect monsters I've ever seen. Next. Another bad vanilla who's a tribute, which makes him even worse because he can't even beat over Lejin, who doesn't require a tribute. Next. Another bad tribute, at least this one is slightly closer to beating Lejin in a fight, which makes him better than most of the other bad tributes in this set, although that doesn't make him good by any means. Next. And now we have another monster with a bad removal effect in Blast Juggler. Now this card is better than Steel Scorpion at least, and was actually somewhat historic in that he was the first 2-for-1 removal effect ever printed, with this card being able to tribute himself to destroy 2 monsters on the field. Sounds too good to be true, right? Unfortunately yes, this card sadly has 2 drawbacks that make him near unplayable. Firstly, it can only be used during the standby phase, meaning that this card has to survive a turn to use its effect, which with its low stats is not very likely. However, what's even worse is the fact that this card can only destroy monsters with 1,000 or less attack, meaning that in the Quitter format, which he was part of, he had only 2 good targets, because he wanted to destroy Sangan, and there's no one to destroy Mighty Bug, meaning our only real target was Magical Hat and Masked Sorcerer. So overall, a groundbreaking effect for sure, just one that would have been better refined later on. Okay, now we're getting to a good one. It's Magician of Faith. Not one of the best cards in this set, not one of the best cards in early Yu-Gi-Oh, but quite possibly one of the best flip monsters ever made. A simple effect, Magician allows us to add 1 spell back to our hand upon flip. Now obviously nowadays in an era dominated by monsters with much more power and much better effects, this doesn't seem like much, but I cannot stress enough how broken this card was in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Firstly, as the game was a lot slower back then, it wasn't unheard of to get this effect off multiple times in a game, either by playing multiple copies or flipping down one of the same copy with things like Book of Moon. This gave control decks in 02, hand control decks in 03, and chaos decks in 04 and 05 the longevity to outlast beatdown strategies by recurring all manner of broken draw cards and removal effects, till they could simply bury the aggro decks in card and field advantage. Which brings me to the second reason why Magician of Faith is so broken, the power level of spells back then. In Go format, this card could essentially grant us 2 to 4 copies of Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity, as well as multiple copies of Lightning Vortex and Delinquent Duo. Going back further to Yatta Chaos format, Magician of Faith can mean extra copies of Painful Choice, Monster Reborn, Confiscation and the Forceful Sentry. Because of this recursive power, Magician of Faith was actually banned for about a decade, long after the card had been completely power-crept out of the game, mostly out of fear older players had, and a card with that much fear behind it has cost me one of the best cards in this set. Okay, I said earlier that the starter deck reprints were mainly anime cards, but we also got a couple of cards like this, random starter deck cards similarly thrown in to pad the set. Nothing much to say about this card, it's a slightly stronger Celtic Guardian which still makes it too weak to see any play. Another Metamorphosis target, Deep Sea Shark being level 5, also been an okay card for instant fusion in rank 5 decks, like Extra Deck Monarchs. Again, not a card played for what it does, but at least it has a purpose. More like Bottom Feeder, it's another trade monster that can't even beat over Lejin. Nothing else to say here, it's just a bad card. Another starter deck reprint filler, this card, like all of them, fails the Dragon Zombie challenge of being a 1600 attack or stronger monster with no effect, and this is unplayable even in 2002 format. Just rewatch the Shark segment, this is literally the same card, but a Wind Thunder, which at least makes it interesting in terms of typing I guess. Next. Whoa, that's one ugly card. Again, nothing to say about this card itself, it's another Chewy that can't beat Lejin. Next. Okay, this is one of the weakest vanillas in this set. Yes, the starter deck reprints are bad, but not this bad. The thing I have to add about this card is a little prediction on my end. I suspect one day we'll get an archetype who uses this card as fodder in the same way that agents use Mystic Shine Ball, but until then, this card is as useless as most vanillas in this set and arguably one of the weakest in that category. I love the juxtaposition between this card's scary flavor text of being an energy-sucking predator and this goofy as heck design. Again, nothing special here, it's another bad vanilla monster, but hey, I got a chuckle out of it at the very least. Okay, so first of all, this is another recolor, with this one being a red version of Gaia Gento Megami. I know I butchered that, I don't care. However, other than the lazy design, we have another good Metamorphosis target for decks like Monarchs and Chaos, and another of the strongest monsters we sent off a Scientist. Next. More pack build from starter deck Kyber. Why couldn't they just reprinted Lajin or Battleox? Heck, there was no Battleox fusion in this set, so it made sense. Next. Okay, this may be one of the weirdest stun effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Whenever this card is destroyed, it prevents monsters that attacked it from attacking next turn. Fair enough, I'll wait one more turn to kill you with it then. Honestly, these effects just baffle me. I mean, sure it gives you one turn to find an out to a big threat like Summon Skull or Lajin, but chances are good that this paralysis will do you little good unless you topped up the card next turn. You'd literally be better off just running more cards that remove monsters like Mani to Bug, or even Wall of Illusion to bounce them, than this card, because at least they deal with the threat if only temporarily. Paralyzing effects like this can work in some card games. In fact, the Pokemon TCG has this as a core mechanic, but it never really caught on in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Unfortunately. Another Lajin test-failing tribute monster. It also has lazy art, it's like Needle, it's just an insect. Next. It's Celtic Guardian but a reptile, which means it's not very good. Next. Another bad tribute that not only fails the Lejin test, but also fails the Dragon Zombie test. The thing about this card is that it inspired a fellow Yugioh YouTuber in Lord Trent, so that's something I guess. Next. Another bad vanilla that saw no play in the TCG at the time. I can at least say this card saw a little bit of play for memories as a secondary machine fusion along with Machine Soldier in the early game, but that's really all I can say about it. Next. Oh, come on, another bad vanilla? This one's water, that's all I can say about it. Can we get a card worth talking about, please? Next. I guess not. Same as the last card, but this one's Earth. Next. Okay, find another card something to talk about at least. A normal trap, this card basically takes the bullet for all your other trap cards, as when an effect is used that would destroy your traps, this card can be destroyed instead. Now, as people who are familiar with this set know, it contains one of the best back row hate in Heavy Storm, so it's understandable why we would get some way of preventing the total blowout that card can cause. However, there are two reasons this card never saw any play. One, most people didn't play enough trap cards around this time for this card to be viable, and two, there is a much better way of dealing with Heavy Storm in the same set. Overall, not an awful card, but like many cards in this set, one too narrow to see any real play. When Yu-Gi-Oh! Was first released, we got very little ways of dealing with monsters outside of battle. We had Raigeki and Dark Hole to deal with boards, but the only single target removal spell we got was Fissure, with the only other option being two-pronged attack. I already explained in the last video how bad that card is. Thankfully in this set we not only got a much improved version of two-pronged attack, but this card, Tribute to the Doomed, a normal spell that for the cost of a discard destroys one monster on the field. Yes, this card is still a neg 1 in terms of card advantage, because you discard a card to use it. However, this effect is the most powerful 1-for-1 move we've had in the game at this point. In addition to this, there are many ways we can turn that discard into a plus, from dumping big monsters to Revenant Monster Reborn, to setting up chaos plays, to dumping Sinister Serpents to avoid paying the cost altogether, to even triggering this set's floaters in the early days before the ruling on those cards was changed. In fact, this card has seen play in a few zombie and chaos decks in GOAT recently for this exact reason. Yes, there will be better removal to come in the next sets, but for this time period, Tribute to the Doom would prefer the best one-for-one removal we had in the game, not only Maya to Bug, which definitely deserves some praise. Another example of a direct upgrade from LOB in Metal Raiders, Soul Release banishes up to 5 cards from either graveyard, making it a far powerful graveyard disruption card than Gravedigger's Ghoul was. Now like Ghoul, this card saw minimal play at the time of release due to the lack of good graveyard targets. However, as the years went on, this card did see a little bit of play, firstly in 2004 and 2005 side decks to counter Chaos cards by removing Light and Darks from the graveyards. In fact, a well-timed Soul release could cripple certain Chaos strategies as many Chaos decks ran much more Dark than Light monsters, making it possible to leave them with no lights to banish and clog their hands with dead BLSs, CEDs and Chaos Soaks. The second use for this card was in Rogue OTK decks that used Return from Different Dimension or Dimension Fusion to bring a bunch of monsters in one turn. And this was never competitively viable per se, as there were far easier ways to do this combo, but it was still fun to pull off in the kitchen table nonetheless. Up next, we've got the greatest Dark World support card ever made. Okay, in all seriousness, the Cheerful Coffin, which allows us to discard up to 3 monster cards for no effect, is clearly meant to be a joker card that was never meant to see any actual play, but the fact that for a brief moment it had its home in a meta deck really shows how important the graveyard would become in Yu-Gi-Oh! Unfortunately for this card, it didn't last long in Dark World, as players quickly realised that cards like Mind Crush, Drag Down from the Grave, and Dark World Dealings were far better options, which tell you how bad this card actually is, that even the deck that only wanted to discard didn't want anything to do with it. And now we have another actually good reprint from the starter decks in Change of Heart, which aside from having one of the best arts in the early game, has a powerful effect that allows us to take control of an opponent's monster till the end of turn. Again, like I did with Potter Greed last time, let me show you how good this effect is by comparing it to later versions of the same effect. Brain Control requires an 100 point cost for the monster. Mind Control prevents attacking and choosing of the monster you stole, and Widow Anchor requires no monsters on the main monster to activate. What makes Change of Heart and effects like it so powerful is that they essentially do the job of a removal spell for a turn, aka get rid of a problematic monster, while also adding to your own field. This not only reduces your opponent's resources, but gives you an extra beater if the monster is big enough, access to all the monster's effects, and a piece of tribute fodder or extra selling material. In fact, if you use the monster you stole for a summon, these cards are removal spells with an upside. Now Change of Heart, like many of the game's early broken cards, did spend a long time on the banned list, over a decade in fact, and then it was released last year. Though it lost some of its power, it did still see play in odd-going second decks like Zodiac and Sky Striker. One of the most iconic cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, Change of Heart was an amazing upon release, and one of the few cards to mostly escape the effects of power creep over the years. Aww, another cute dragon. Again, like Petite Dragon, this card isn't very good, but its art is adorable. Also, I will give this card a little bit of credit for 1, being part of several big moments in the anime, and 2, being part of the most on-flavor fusion summon in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, most of which were really weird. The very first card we saw Yugi summon in the anime, and that's all I've got to say about this generic looking dragon that fails the dragon zombie test. Next. Okay, I will say these two cards have an interesting concept, in that they are two friends who support each other and make each other stronger when they are both out at the same time. In theory this could be pretty cool. Pity then that not only do they only grant each other a measly 500 point buff, but they are also both tribute monsters, meaning at best you're getting a slightly stronger Curse of Dragon and a Gaia the Fierce Knight. Two cards that, as we saw in the last list, aren't worth playing by themselves. What a waste of a cool idea. Okay, change the last word of this card's name to Ox, remove 100 attack points in a star, and this card would be good. Unfortunately, this card is not. Next. What does it take to make a field wipe so bad that it's unplayable even in slow-ass early Yu-Gi-Oh? How about giving a 50% chance of blowing our own board up instead? You see, the Time Wizard here allows us to flip a coin, and if we call it right, we get to Raigeki the opponent's field. Now that would be good if it didn't Raigeki us as well if we call it wrong. Now a nuke that explodes in our own face half the time would be bad enough, however it's even more unfavourable to us. You see, if Time Wizard hits our opponent, they just lose their board, but if he hits us, we also lose a large chunk of our life points, meaning this card can not only be a massive minus, but in some situations he can lead to us being OTK'd the next turn. Again, like Baby Dragon, I will give him credit for the flavour of the win in his fusion summon, but it's nowhere near enough to call it a good card. Sorry, Joey. Another bad vanilla that appeared in the anime. I guess you could argue that this card was a Crush Card virus target in the OCG when released, as the virus came out over half a decade earlier in Japan than here in the West, but even then there were much better targets even at that time. Next. Okay, let's say you're a dragon player in early Yugioh and your opponent flips a dragon capture jar on you. Do you A. hope to draw, summon and flip this awful card, or B. just summon Skull over the dragon? Next. Another vanilla tribute that admittedly has amazingly creepy artwork. Not much to say here other than hope we get a retrain of this card with the new illusionist type. Finally, another card with a lot of things to talk about. Sangan, or Quitter as he was called in the OCG, is a 1000 attack fiend monster that when he's sent to the graveyard from the field, allows you to add a monster from deck to hand with 1500 or less attack. Which is a spellcaster that does the same thing for monsters with 1500 or less defense. Or at least that's what they used to say, but we'll get to that in a second. Now there are several cards in this set that fundamentally changed how Yugioh was played, and Sangan along with his partner in crime Witch as two of those cards. As I covered in the LOB video, the very first Yu-Gi-Oh format was almost entirely dominated by aggro decks, like Standard Beatdown, Blue Eyes and Fiend Beatings, because control really wasn't an option yet, with very little extra card draw and not enough removal cards. This all changed in this set, as we got cards like Masked Sorcerer for consistent card draw, Tribute to the Doomed and White Magical Hats to limit aggro players' resources, and tying all this together with Sangan and Witch, able to search all of these good monsters. These cards pretty much by themselves make control decks viable in Yu-Gi-Oh, as now they have consistent access to draw, power and removal with Mai to Bug as well. These two cards will continue to see play through 2004, where they were combined with CED to perform the Yatta Lock combo, something which we would see which would be one of the first cards ever banned. Sangan, however, will be undeterred, seeing play in nearly all of GOAT format's decks, as a way of searching removal with Exile Force and DD Warrior Lady, as well as cards like Magician of Faith and Sinister Serpent. In fact, he got even better at this point, as he could be tributed for a Monarch monster and then get a Surge after. He would then see more success a few years later with the, at the time, new release of Token from the Underworld, and ultimately the first generation of Rank 3 XEs. Years later, after Sangan also got banned, both he and Witch would be released with new erratas that prevented you from using the monster that you searched at the end of the turn. Now while Witch didn't see much play upon release, Sangan, being a fiend, started right into decks that used Cherubini of the Burning Abyss. Overall, many cards in this set changed Yu-Gi-Oh! Forever, but few have such a long and lengthy an impact as these two. Also, I'm likely to do a full video on these in the future, so stay tuned for that. So now we have the final part of the Cocoon of Evolution line in Great Moth. So is this card worth waiting 4 turns to summon? No, of course not. Haven't you been paying attention? It's just a 2600 attack vanilla that would be bad enough if it was a normal summon, but making it take 4 turns to summon is borderline criminal. Next! Okay, now we've got a slightly lesser known part of Yu-Gi-Oh history in the form of the very first hand trap, Kuribo. Well known for its appearances in the anime, Kuribo can be discarded from our hand to prevent one source of damage. As you can tell, hand traps have come a long way since this little guy. Now honestly, for the game's very first hand trap, this isn't terrible, and I could definitely see it catching an opponent by surprise. However, it just isn't strong enough to see play because unlike good hand traps, it doesn't affect the board at all, meaning all it does is buy you one more turn at most. But still, we should thank this guy for lighting the spark that ignited the fire that was modern day hand traps, so thank you Kuribo for making our modern game much more interactive. Wow, another bad water monster. These have actually been one of the worst types in this series so far. Also, yeah, it's just a jellyfish. Real creative there, Konami. Next. Another oddly pointed monster like Reaper of the Cards from last time, Castle of Dark Illusions is a 1930 defense level 4 that grants zombie monsters a 200 point buff every turn for 4 turns, which is weird because that was Pumpkin's effect in the anime, and in real life this card just pumps him up by an extra 100 points, which begs the question of why they called him Pumpkin when he does no pumping. Nothing else for you to say, it's just an okay wall with a mediocre effect. Next. Another weird stat monster, King of Yami Makai, is a 2000 attack, 1530 defense monster, and so that's the only interesting aspect of this card, otherwise he's just a curse of dragon with slightly more defense points. Next. A quick lesson for anyone out there looking to make their own TCG in the future. If you don't plan on having set rotation in the game, make damn sure you future-proof your cards to make sure they won't be broken beyond belief a few sets later, because if you don't, you end up with things like this. Catapult Turtle is a 1 tribute monster that allows you to tribute a monster to inflict damage to the opponent equal to half that monster's attack points. Notably, it's not once per turn. As you can imagine, this eventually led to people finding ways to OTK and even FTK with this card, most notably with Magical Scientist, who would summon 6 fusions with 2,000 more attack points to fire from the Catapult Turtle, essentially killing your opponent with 6,000 life points. As such, Scientist was banned, and Turtle got errated to a hard once per turn some years later. So all in all, a great card that taught Konami a valuable lesson about once per turn effects, that they didn't actually learn because then they made things like Infinity years later. Another fusion material monster made obsolete by Metamorphosis, and a bad static reprint. Seriously, why can't we just call them Battle Ox instead? Next. The same thing I said about Empress Judge and Snake apply here too. Decent Scientist target, good with Metamorphosis and Instant Fusion. Much else to say, I'm afraid. Next. And now we have the first of the 2 clown monsters introduced in this set, Crass Clown. A 1350 attack monster, Crass Clown and its partner Dream Clown gain effects when their battle modes are switched. In this case, when changed from defense to attack, Crass Clown bounces the monster back to its owner's hand. Now, while being the weaker of the 2 clowns, Crass is still a part of a deck known as Clown Control, which is a rogue option between 2003 and 2005. Essentially a stall deck, Clown Control uses all the floodgates seen in burn strategies, along with the clowns, and the idea is to slowly take over the game by constantly changing the clowns' modes to keep the opposing field clear. Never a top meta contender, Clown Control was a solid rogue choice for years, and Crass Clown here definitely deserves some credit for this. I already talked about this card in the Castle of Dark Illusions entry, so all I'll add here is that this card was a beast from vivid memories, being one of the better early game monsters along with Flame Cerberus. Everything I said earlier about Crass Clown still applies to Dream Clown in terms of its use in Clown Control. However, Dream Clown is far stronger than his rude counterpart. You see, Dream Clown gets his effect from changing from defense to attack mode, and when he does, he destroys a monster as opposed to simply bouncing it. Not really that makes him stronger of the two, because destroying a monster is usually better than putting it back in the hand, where it can be easily reused in the following turn. But the fact that he gets the effect from going from attack to defense gives him much more synergy with cards like Stumbling, which makes triggering his effect super easy. Overall, the better of the 2 clown monsters, Dream Clown is the face of Clown Control, and rightly so, making the deck an unlikely rogue powerhouse in early years of Yu-Gi-Oh! Despite being a large brain, Tainted Wisdom isn't very smart or useful, as all it allows us to do is shuffle our deck when it goes to defense position. Yeah, no thanks, I think I'll just start using, every search card in the game to shuffle my deck, and gain advantage while I'm at it, thanks. One thing I didn't mention about Tainted Wisdom is that it's a fusion material for the terrible fusion monster Skull Knight, and here's the other material in Ancient Brain, another bad vanilla. Nothing more to add here other than, how did 2 brains make a skeleton warrior? One of life's great mysteries, I guess. Another terrible fusion material normal monster, this card actually got a retrain into one of the most mediocre links ever made. Next. Another monster to add to the list of level 4 2k defenders, Prevent Rat, unlike the likes of Aquamador and Giant Soldier of Stone, never really saw play due to his low stats, and the game already moving on from no effect walls being good. Next. Okay, if this card was a 1500 attack vanilla, it would be bad enough, but the fact that it also requires the tributes to get up to those stats makes it one of the worst cards in this set. Yes, you could technically tribute more than one monster to boost his points further, but would you tribute 2 monsters for a 22 attack vanilla? Yeah, I didn't think so either. Now we come to another excellent side deck card for the time in Princess of Tazuri. A flip monster, Princess deals 500 points of damage to the opponent for each spell and trap card they control. The only thing this card was used in burn decks at the time, however no, this card was actually used as a way to win in time, seeing play in the side deck of various critter format decks for this reason. Now the card didn't see play for long, as better burn options became available soon after this, but at least we can say she saw play in almost every deck in the game at one point, not something many cards can claim. A bad vanilla infusion material monster that gets beat by every beta played at the time. Next. Okay, so last time we looked at LOB and cards like Hinotama, we talked about early versions of burn decks, and in this set, those decks got a major boost with tremendous fire. A normal spell, fire does 500 points of damage to you and 1000 to your opponent. A simple effect, and one burn really needed around this time. First of all, ignore the damage done to you, you're playing burn, you don't care. Let's look at how burn improved tremendously with this card. Now the quickest way to kill an opponent with burn prior to this card was 3 Ukazi for 2400 damage, 3 Final Flame for 1800, 3 Hinotama for 1500, and 1 or 2 Just Desserts for the last 2300, meaning that pure burn wasn't too good prior to this card. Now, however, we have 3000 from 3 copies of this, 2400 from Ukazi, 1800 from Final Flame, and then we will need 1000 from 1 Just Desserts to win. So yeah, essentially this card put burn on the map, and will eventually lead to the deck that is currently one of the top decks in GOAT format. Now despite Sangan Witch essentially turning Yu-Gi-Oh into more of a control focused game, it's not as if aggro decks just up and died when they were released, as Konami threw them a few bones in this set, starting with Jorai Gumo, the biggest normal summon at the time with a whopping 2200 attack points. However, given this is early 2000s Yu-Gi-Oh, that attack bonus comes with a price. Namely that whenever this card attacks, you develop a coin, and if you call it wrong you lose half your life points. Okay, before we write this card off as packed full of trash, let me just say that it's not as bad as it seems. Like I said, this card was used in aggro decks, which typically only care about their last life point, as they win so fast low life points rarely come up as a problem. So assuming your deck doesn't care about loss of life, what do we have here? We've got a level 4 that can compete over almost every monster played at the time, and one that can 4-shot an opponent on an empty board. Yeah, not hard to see why this card saw play despite the massive downside. Up next we have one of the more interesting weak tribute monsters in Shadow Ghoul. A 600 attack 1 tribute monster, Ghoul gains 100 points for each monster in your graveyard, meaning if played late this card can become massive for 1 tribute. So in theory this card could have been played in aggro decks as a last resort, with cards like Sangan and Witch filling the graveyard. However in practice it just wasn't worth it next to cards like Legion and 7 Coloured Fish, who always had higher attack points that weren't affected by outside forces. A pity, as I think in another world this card could have been a really good card. Oh well, at least got a pretty cool retrain in the Labyrinth deck last year. Another level 7 fusion monster, Labyrinth Tank has all the problems of cards like Gaia and Skull Knight, and that's a bad metamorphosis target because of its level, and it can't be used with scientists for that reason either. We also got a good rework in the Gate Guardian deck a couple of years ago. Next. And now we've got another good starter deck reprint with Ryukushin Powered, a 600 attack 4-star Fiend. Now being a 600 attack monster, this card is strong enough to see a little play in the Fiend Beatings deck in Yugi Kaiba format. They use a lot of dark monsters along with all the good equips for darks and fiends available to inflict massive damage quickly, using the likes of Lajin, Dragon Zombie and this card, along with Dark Energy and the Dark Sword. Again, not an amazing card, I was only using a rogue at best deck, but there's still more play than a lot of these cards in this set got. Just rewatch the Labyrinth Tank and Skull Knight sections. It's literally the same thing, just 100 points weaker than Labyrinth Tank and a Dark Monster. Next. Okay, next up we have Guilty of the Dark Knight, quite possibly one of the best fusions from early Yu-Gi-Oh, entirely because it was a level 5 light monster. This means that in addition to being an OK metamorphosis target in GOAT format, it was one of the best instant fusion targets in the XCs era, because it could be used to make Constellar Pleiades, one of the best XCs of the early XCs era. This combo saw play in a few decks, most notably Extra Deck Monarchs, and although it wouldn't last too long, it's cool that a vanilla fusion from 2002 could see a little play as late as 2016. It's a 2 tribute monster with stats that will be battled on a 1 tribute monster. You know a 7 card is bad when a 4-star card can match it in battle. Next. 1200 attack Villa monster, stop being good after OCG 1 Konami, and this one's no exception. It's just a silver fang with a slightly higher defense and mechanical parts. Next. Now we come to an interesting card, and one in my opinion you wouldn't think could be good just looking at it. It's Thunder Dragon, a level 5 effect monster that can be discarded from hand to search 2 more copies of itself from the deck. Now like I said, on the surface adding 2 essentially effectless tribute monsters from deck to hand isn't great, but there are several reasons that this card is not just good, but a meta warper for several years. First of all, this card thins the deck by 2 cards when its effect is used. Now in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! This doesn't seem like much, however back when the game was a lot slower, longer and grindier, 2 less cards in the deck could be the difference between a brick and a game-winning draw. Secondly, this card generated great discard fodder once the 2 copies are in your hand. While not as good as the other green snake-like creature, Thunder Dragon was still a card you could pitch to things like Regeki Break without losing any card advantage. And finally, it's a light monster you could easily place in the graveyard. That's exactly what the kind of card that Chaos decks love. As I've said, Chaos decks tended to play much more dark than light monsters, so that you could keep in your hands till you were ready to go off was invaluable. In fact, this card was so good it even spawned its own version of Chaos in GOAT format that was far faster than the usual Chaos control decks. Thunder Dragon would fade into obscurity after 2006 when Chaos was fully banned, but its legacy lives on to this day in the form of Thunder Dragon Archetypes, which is one of the best decks of the late 2010s. Now we actually have a good vanilla in this set with 7 coloured fish. Also yeah, we did get a good water card in this after all. Another 800 4-star monster, Fish along with Lejin and the 2000 plus monsters in this set were the main reason we still saw a powerful aggro deck stay competitively viable in the face of decks like Critic Control. No matter what else to say about this card, is a solid beta and a solid for the time aggro deck. Next. And now from one of the strongest normal monsters in the set, we move to one of the worst effect monsters in the Immortal of Thunder. Essentially this card's effect is it burns you for 2000 upon destruction. Yes, there is more to it than that, but 9 times out of 10, that's what this card will do. You see, this card will gain you 3000 life points on summon, but it will then burn you for 5000 when being sent to the graveyard. And most of the time, both of those effects will happen at the same time because he's only got 1300 defense points. Also, the loss of life happens regardless of how he's sent to the graveyard, so I don't think you can get around this by tripping him off either. Like I said, I bought a lot of Metal Raiders as a kid, and this is one of the few cards I pulled that I never played, so it must have been bad if even 7-year-old me knew how crap it was. Another decent instant fusion, metamorphosis and scientist target. Not much else to say about it than that though, it's just a regular winged beast otherwise. You know, with some of these cards, I have to wonder if any testing was done, because I can't imagine anyone at the time played this card and actually got the boost effect. An insect monster, Soldiers of the Sky, gains 1000 attack whenever it attacks a wind monster. The problem here being that there was no good winds at the time, with Harpy not being playable yet, and all the vanillas being too weak to see play. What were they thinking with this card? Now again we look at several monsters as one, with the attack gainers or a series of small monsters that give a monster of the same attribute a 500 point attack boost and a 400 defense decrease. I'm carrying them all at once because they are all the same and all suck for the same reason, that being that they're all too weak to last more than a turn, which makes their boost practically useless. The one exception to this is Milius Radiant, the Earth version of this effect, who saw play both in Forbidden Memories as the best beast to make Flame Cerberus, and more importantly in Rescue Cat decks in GOAT format, which use Rescue Cat and Last Will to summon 2 Gagugeri Pandas and 2 Radiants to attempt an OTK. Now all these cards got reimaginings as links that also play in early Master Rule 4, and again the Earth one was the best, seeing most of its play in Zodiac decks. Overall most of these cards Okay, another generic fusion here. Yeah, metamorphosis, instant fusion, you know the drill. But someone please explain to me how Lady of Faith and Witch of the Black Forest make this card. I know fusion materials were weird back in the day, but this is kind of ridiculous, don't you think? Okay, I really wanted to call this one of the best sets ever due to the amount of game warping and simply OP cards it has, but I can in good consciousness do that when a set also has cards like this. A level 4 water monster, Yasagaru, like the clowns, has an effect that triggers when it's changed from attack to defense. And what an effect! You see this card lets you take any number of cards in your hand and put them at the bottom of your deck in any order. And that's it. Yeah, no drawing cards to replace the ones you put away, no additional bonus for going at least -1, nothing. Again, I'm assuming this card was a joke, but given the amount of work you need to do to use it, I do have some reserves while calling it one. Was the idea to put cards back when Magical Hat couldn't get them? To refill your deck with witches and Sangan targets late game? I don't know and don't care to figure it out either. One of the absolute worst cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Let's move on. Same as before, another good target for instant fusion metamorphosis and in a pinch magical scientist. It's also a machine, so it has some synergy with Cyber Dragon decks that want to play instant fusion. Next. Yeah, remember the Catapult Turtle entry when I mentioned cards that were not future-proofed? Well, here's another great example of that with Cannon Soldier. Cannon Soldier is a machine that allows you to tribute a monster to do 500 points of damage to the opponent, and yes, it's also not once per turn. Now at first this card's use was fairly innocent, seeing play in decks that use Sangan and Witch to tribute them off to get their floating effects. However, as you can imagine, this card didn't stay so innocent for very long, and so people were finding numerous ways to FTK with this burn effect, most probably in 2018 when numerous decks used Firewall Dragon to create a loop of monsters to fire at the opponent for 8,000 or more damage. Funnily enough, unlike Catapult Turtle, Cannon Soldier is still unerrated, and as such is always in discussion to be banned along with his Toon counterpart. Whether that will happen or not is unknown, but I'm sure we haven't seen the last of this card in Yu-Gi-Oh! And sometime in the future another genius will find a way to break it once more. Another card that surprisingly saw a period of meta relevance, Muka Muka, is a level 3 instant that gains 300 attack and defense points for every card in your hand, kind of like a mini Slifer the Sky Dragon. Now, as I said in Critter format, all the top decks were control decks that used Sangan and Witch, and the best deck used Mass Sorcerer to draw more cards. Along with this, Heavy Storm and Mirror Force were now legal, which meant a lot of players would play more conservatively, only playing 1 to 2 cards in the field at a time to avoid being blown out by one of these cards. With all this in mind, it's not to see why some decks gravitated towards Muka Muka, as their hands were often big enough to make the card ginormous. Sadly, this card will drop off the face of the earth in the next set due to hand destruction cards being printed, but it'll always have this one moment in the spotlight. Okay, wow, another contender for one of the worst monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! History. This set really is a study in contrast, isn't it? The Bistro Butcher, like Lajin and 7 Coloured Fish, is another 800 attack body. However, unlike those two cards, you would never see this guy in a standard beatdown deck, or any other deck for that matter, because they're one of the worst downsides of any card in this game's history. You see, every time this card inflicts damage to your opponent, they get a Pot of Greed. No, I'm serious, they get to draw 2 cards and this card deals damage. Do I need to say anything else about this? This is one of the worst cards ever printed, it has to be. Okay, another mediocre tribute monster, but at least everyone's got one place where it was great, Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories. You see, early game this was one of the biggest monsters you could make, and it carried many gamers, including me, to the first half of the game. So thanks Flame Cerberus, and I'm sorry I couldn't make it past the point when you stopped being relevant. Next. It's a fat chicken. Yeah, just throw this one in the pan with some vegetables and leave the Yu-Gi-Oh! To the good cards. Next. Much like Jiraigumo, Dark Elf is another effect monster with above normal level 4 stats. In fact, it's literally mystical elf stats in reverse. That's high stats came with a cost. In this case, it costs you 1000 points to attack. Now, everything I said about Gumo in his entry still applies here. Aggro decks don't care about taking damage, and this card's massive stats for level 4 make it worth playing. However, I would argue this card is a lot worse because 1, it has less points than Jiraigumo, and 2, unlike Gumo, we can't avoid taking damage when it attacks. Whereas with a Jiroi, there was a chance that if you are a coin flipping god, you could go through the whole game with taking no damage. Now, none of this makes this card bad for aggro decks at the time, and it's also still a lot of playing beatdown decks in Critter format, but it is weaker than Jiraigumo overall. You know, if I made this video last year, this would have been a card I had nothing to say about. An Earth Monster, Mushroom Man 2, has the effect that it burns the control of 300 points every turn. You can also pay 500 points to give it to your opponent. So yeah, last year I'd have called this card an awful burn effect, and left it at that. And then we got Kashtira. For those who don't know, Kashtira is the current strongest deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! With powerful monsters and an awful amount of floodgates. However, the deck has one big weakness, which is that all their monsters need an empty field to summon themselves. As such, decks that didn't need a normal summon could cite this card and give it to the opposing Kashtira players, essentially locking them out of the game. Now, will this card see play again after Kashtira is fully banned in Resistance? Unlikely, but you never know. Not only another worthless vanilla monster, but one of the weirdest fusion materials ever made. No, seriously, how did this card on Witch make Magician King again? I still don't get that. Anyway, next. Up next, we have the best card in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! For the PS1. Yeah, anyone who's actually suffered through Forbidden Memories knows that this was one of the best monsters you could actually get in the game, and likely use it to grind through that awful game. Sadly, the TCG didn't do nearly as well, only seeing play as a Metamorphosis target that was rarely used to its level. Also, like I said last time, its art was used in LOB already, just a different colour and reversed. Next. A 4-star vanilla that is just as strong as Dragon Zombie, meaning it could have potentially seen play in early beatdown decks, but never really did because Dragon Zombie is a dark, and therefore has better equip options than this card. Next. Another bad fusion, Skull Knight, despite his cool look, is too big for Magical Scientist and the worst level for Metamorphosis. What a waste of such cool art. Another vanilla level 4 that fails the Dragon Zombie test. That being said, its retrain along with the Bird from and Chimera retrains are really cool, and I'm looking to try them out myself soon. Next. It's Red Eyes Black Dragon, but an elephant and earth attribute. Nothing else to say about it. Next. Okay, before we talk about this card's effects, can I say that of all the cards that were edited in the West to be more kid-friendly, this one has by far the best changes. Sure, the original was quite menacing with its realistic looking guns, but the TCG version has lasers for a face. How cool is that? Also, its Toon card part is hilarious. So looking at the actual card, Barrel Dragon has the effect to destroy a monster if 2 of 3 coin tosses are heads. This effect is actually a pretty decent one. It will more often than not pull a monster, and the fact that it's not guaranteed means it can actually play around Stardust Dragon. In fact, a version of this card called Blowback Dragon did see play in Chaos and Monster Gate decks in GOAT. Unfortunately, this card was dead in arrival because it requires 2 tributes, something most decks cannot afford to do at the time. Like I said, it did get a decent retrain in Blowback Dragon, so it wasn't utterly pointless, but talk about a good effect hampered by too many stars. And now we have, in my view, not just the strongest card in Metal Raiders, but quite possibly one of the top 5 greatest trap cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, Solemn Judgment. Arguably the greatest counter trap ever made, Judgment, for half your life points, can negate the summon or activation of any card. In essence, this card just says no to anything. Yes, it'll cost you half your life points, but as we've seen in this video, in Yu-Gi-Oh! You gotta think like a big business here. Life doesn't actually matter. Arguably, this card should have been seen play in every deck at the time for its ability to essentially save you from the worst case scenarios, but it actually took till 2008 for this card to see widespread adoption, only seeing play in the aforementioned aggro decks that didn't care about the life points before this. However, upon the release and domination of Synchro Monsters, we realised that this card negating a Stardust, for example, will essentially be a +2, as not only were you stopping the Synchro from being used, you were also making its materials worthless too. As such, we can see this card in most decks in Edison, and would stay stable for many years, even still seeing play today in many side decks, and in back row decks for protection like Eldritch and Labyrinth. In fact, in modern versions of Quitter format, many of the players have started mainly inciting this card as an out to blow out cards like Mirror Force and Heavy Storm, and it started seeing more play in GOAT format with faster decks like Cat Combo, Burn and Cold Wave Monarchs taking over. Overall, Judgment is a prime example of simple yet effective, as one of the longest played cards from early Yu-Gi-Oh! This card is still putting up tops today, as likely to stop anytime soon. Another card that does what it says on the tin, Magic Jammer for the cost of a discard, allows you to negate a spell. Now in this set we have traps that negate spells, traps that negate other traps, and traps that negate any card in the game, but sadly this one is the one that has seen the least amount of play, only really seeing play in Pixie Control and a couple of side decks in GOAT format. The reason for this is simple. Paying life points is a far better cost than discarding a card, as the latter leaves you down in card advantage, making it more likely for control decks to outpace you. As such, even though it can stop some of the game's strongest cards, Jammer never saw much play outside of Pixie Control, which is a deck that has room for it because it only has 6 spell cards in it. A shame, but understandable. Now, as we've seen in this video, trap cards got a lot better in Yu-Gi-Oh! In this set, with Mirror Force and Solemn Judgment being meta-warping boogeymen. So as you can imagine, we needed an equally powerful way of fighting these jigsaw quality traps. Enter the literal Swiss Army knife 7 tools of the Bandit. A simple effect, Bandit for the cost of 1000 life points negates any trap card. And this is a prime example of a card destined for side deck greatness, and indeed for many years it was, from its printing in 2002 till the first time the game really sped up in 2008. This card was a great side deck option against aggro decks that used the likes of Solemn Judgment, as well as against burn decks, where cards like Justice Earth would deal you more than 1000 damage. This card would start seeing less play as time went on, mostly because people realised it was just better to stick Solemn Judgment in every deck. But for helping many of us new players survive the terror of Mirror Force and its ilk, this card will always have a place in my heart. Sometimes in Yu-Gi-Oh! A card can be released and then fly completely under the radar for years before some bright spark realises how good it is. Horn of Heaven is one such card. A counter trap, this card allows you to tribute a monster to negate a summon. Now like I said, this card saw near enough no play upon release, other than the occasional side deck in critter format, and stayed that way for many years. That is until the release of a little card called Guiding Ariadne. A fairy monster, Ariadne, upon being destroyed, allowed its controller to search for 3 counter traps and force the opponents add one to their hand. Now like most broken cards, Ariadne is not a once per turn, and 2 decks, Counter Fairies and Dracopal variants, took advantage of this to search at least 3 counters a turn. But at this time, Solemn Judgment was still banned, so in addition to strikes and warnings, several decks chose to either play this or Black Horn of Heaven. So yeah, it took a while for this card to see play, but it demonstrated an impact on the game when it did. Another famous anime card, Shield and Sword, is quite unique, as I can't really think of any equivalent card to it in the game since. A normal spell, it switches the attack and defense values of all monsters on the field for a turn. Now like I said, it's definitely a unique effect, but sadly not one that was particularly good, as there were far better ways of dealing with a Summon Skull in attack mode, or defense position wall at Mystical Elf, the 2 best uses for this card. Now that being said, if Crit format ever becomes as popular as the other retro formats, I can absolutely see people citing this card in defense-oriented strategies, so here's hoping for some creativity with this card in the future. So to my older viewers, do you remember when Rise of the Storm Monarch was dominating the meta by stacking top of the opponent's deck? Or if you're a little bit younger, do you remember when Phoenix Wind Blast was doing the same thing in Burning Abyss? Do you ever wish you could do that to yourself? No? Then why did Konami think generic equips that stack the top of your deck on destruction were any good? You see, the Sword of Deep Sea is a pretty generic equip card for the time that gives a monster a 500 point boost. Not great, but better than most equips. Unfortunately, it has another effect. When it's sent to the graveyard, it instead goes to the top of your deck. Now on the surface, you might think that this isn't too bad. After all, you can completely use this card to power up your monsters in an era full of beatdown decks. How is that not good? Well, unfortunately, this card is not optional, meaning that more often than not, this card is likely just going to stack your deck, preventing you from drawing it out to the opponent's field, rather than helping you win. I'm not saying this card couldn't sometimes be useful, and they would never want to recur it, but the non-optional nature of this recursion effect makes this card way too risky to see any real play. In the LOB list, we talked about Stop Defense, a normal spell that changed a monster from defense to attack mode, and here we get its counterpart, Block Attack, which changes the monster from attack to defense. Now like its predecessor, this card did have some uses back in the day, as most of the commonly played beaters like Skull, Ox, Lajin and Dragon Zombie had very low defense points, making this card a prototypical Book of Moon. However, it being a normal spell, the expanded card pool Metal Raiders, and there being better removal now, made this card no near as powerful as Book of Moon or Stop Defense, and it saw next to no play compared to those 2 cards. Such a pity, but at least this card and Darkness Approaches in the next set walked so Book of Moon can run. Now if you played during tier format, you remember that this card, Neko Main King, a card that ends the turn when sent to the graveyard. Well, that card wouldn't be released for a couple of years yet, but in this set we got a precursor to that in the form of the Unhappy Maiden, a card that only triggers when destroyed by battle and only ends the battle phase as opposed to the whole turn. Yeah, I guess that's why she's sad. She was upstaged by a cat. Honestly, this card isn't terrible, just very underwhelming, and unlike King, she never really found a niche. Another card to see a little play in critter format, Robbing Goblin is a continuous trap. Whenever your opponent takes battle damage, force them to discard a card at random from their hand. Now like I said, aggro decks at the time took somewhat of a backseat to critter control decks when the set dropped. However, Robbing Goblin was a little bone thrown to aggro players, by being sort of a counterplay to Masked Sorcerer that helps prevent control decks from outgrinding us. In fact, this card combined with White Magical Hat can be seen as a precursor to hand control, the deck that would win Worlds 1 year later. Now, Robbing Goblin wouldn't last as long competitive card due to being power crept by the discard spells in Spell Ruler, but it will always have with this one moment in critter format, which is more than a lot of cards even get. Now, with this set obsession with small effects that happen each turn, here we have Germ Infection, an equipped card which, if equipped to a non-machine, weakens it by 300 points each turn. Now yes, in theory this could be used to take out a bigger monster with a normal summon like Lajin. However, again, why go through that trouble when you could just play Fisher or Tribute to the Doomed? I mean, again, it's a decent flavour win with a Germ making a monster sicker each turn, but it's not really good enough to see any play. Well, this is just a slightly better version of the Electric Lizard, and that's a card that rather than killing a monster just stuns it. I mean, you can't call it false advertising, it does what the name suggests. Now, like the Electric Lizard, the problem with this card is it actually doesn't really accomplish much beyond making the game longer, as if you use this card in a big monster like Lejin, Fish or Summoned Skull, it's true they won't be able to attack you, but you still can't get over them, or why would you play this card in the first place? So again, it's not an awful effect, but there's literally no reason to play this card over any good removal spell. It's rare that a card comes along that is so powerful that it not only dominates the game for years, but completely changes how people play the game. This is one such card. A normal trap, Mirror Force, upon attack being declared, will destroy all opposition monsters on the opponent's side of the field. Now again, this is a card that would be considered too slow to see play nowadays. However, if you are aware of older store forms of Yu-Gi-Oh like Goat, you should know why this card was so feared for so long. Like I said, the fear of getting blown out by this card was so great that it changed many habits players had for years, essentially forced them to not go all out with their attacks, leading to slower, grindier formats where control-based decks replace aggro ones at the top decks of the competitive scene. In fact, if you go and watch some old Go format duels on YouTube, you'll hear players talking about playing around both this card and another one we'll talk about soon. Now granted, these days many players simply run 3 giant True Need and every other back row hates cards and just try to win as fast as possible, but the fear of a Mirror Force is still present, making these faster matches more exciting if you can't remove back row. Overall, Mirror Force is not the king of retro Yu-Gi-Oh that it used to be, however for its dominance in control decks and the legacy of respect and fear it achieved, I have still to call it one of the best cards in Metal Raiders. Here we have another example of a card that was mediocre to bad, made so much worse by a needless cost. You see, as its name suggests, this card magnetizes one of your monsters, making it the only card your opponent can attack. So okay, slap this on a mystical Alpha Giant Soldier and watch the aggro deck squirm, right? Well, that would be the case were not for this drawback the card has, which is that the monster equipped with it loses 500 defense points. And with that one line of text, this card becomes unusable because most defense monsters at this time had 2000 or less defense, while most aggro monsters had 600 or higher attack, making this card essentially a kill spell to any monster you put it on. I'm not saying this card would have been good if that line hadn't been there, but that cost guaranteed it would never see play, sadly. Okay, I've been talking about how certain cards in this set, whether they were good or bad, were upgrades from LOB cards, and I can't think of a better example of this than Share the Pain, which is what 2-point attack should have been. Now yes, you don't choose the monster your opponent loses, as both players sacrifice a monster, but it's still a better card than attack, because it's only a -1 rather than -2, which yes, isn't great, but with cards like Sangan and Witch, you can mitigate some of the tempo loss. Honestly not a great card, but still okay removal for the time period. Once again we have two of the worst aspects of Metal Raiders, weak equips and terrible downsides to already mediocre effects in Stim Pack, which when equipped grants the monster a 700 point boost. However, every turn after the boost, this card reduces the equipped monster's points by 200. Now at this time in the game, a 700 point boost isn't horrible, as another beatdown is still a popular strategy, but the issue is, as the game is especially slow at this point, with the increasing control strategies like flip control and critic control, meaning the chances are the game would drag on long enough that this card would eventually make your monster weaker than when you started. Because of this card really wasn't useful even by early Yu-Gi-Oh standards, and was completely power crept in the next set with Axe of Despair and Horn of the Unicorn. And now we come to the final entry in this set series of game warping broken cards, with Heavy Storm, a normal spell that destroys every spell trap card on the field. Pretty much what Mirror Force did for monsters, Heavy Storm did for back row, in that it forced more conservative play of only setting one card till the coast was clear, to avoid being blown out. But I'd argue that Heavy Storm is even more powerful than Mirror Force in this case, because as we've already established, Mask of Darkness did not see that much play alongside Mirror Force, the same way Magician of Faith saw play alongside Storm, meaning Go players had to potentially deal with multiple back row wipes as opposed to the one monster wipe of Mirror Force. Now it did take a little time for people to realise just how good Heavy Storm was, as that to be compared to another spell and trap nuke in Harpy's Feather Duster at the time, which only wiped the opponent's back row as opposed to both players, meaning although both cards were played in early Yu-Gi-Oh, Harpy's was considered an all-around better card. However, once Harpy's was out of the picture, many players realised that in reality there isn't much difference between these two cards, as you could simply activate Storm when you had no back row, essentially being another Harpy's. In fact, it's even better if you did have some back row that you wanted in the graveyard, as few of those as there were back then. In fact, nowadays the opinion on these cards seems to have reversed, with Duster now being at 1 while Storm is still banned, with no release day in sight. This is because with how the game has evolved over the years, popping your own spell and traps is now massively beneficial, as many modern pieces of back row have powerful graveyard effects, so nowadays Storm is essentially Feather Duster that also grants you several extenders. Honestly, in my opinion, even more so than Mirror Force or Judgment, Heavy Storm signifies the power creep of this set, and the card designers attempted to push the game's power level, and in my view was a massive success in acceptable power creep. And to conclude this set we have Thousand Dragon, another vanilla fusion monster who's too weak to see much play, being too high a level for Magical Scientist and a bad level for Metamorphosis. However, I will say it's a bit of a flavour win, because unlike most fusions in these last two sets, it actually does make sense. Because I can see how a baby dragon plus a time warp makes an old dragon, but I can't see how two brains make a skeleton warrior, so I can give it that at least, even though it is a bit of a damp script to end this set on. Hopefully in the next set we'll get a secret that's actually worthy of that spot, but I won't hold my breath on that. So to sum it up, is Metal Raiders as good as I remember it being from my youth? Not really, no. It still has many of the same issues that LOB had, including bad vanillas and underpowered back row, and adds on to this by printing a few of the worst effect monsters of all time. However, it does contain many powerful and game-altering cards as well, and you can tell the creators were getting the hang of making good effect monsters this time around. So overall, the best that we covered so far. I look forward to seeing what Konami has in store for us next when we look at Spell Rulers.